Althea, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I'm sorry you don't have anything else to do tonight. It's such a nice night. And as you can tell, the title matches exactly with what Althea said. So, I had a column in the paper actually yesterday, and did any of you see this column? Yes. All right. Well, I thought it was timely. What's that? Bait and switch. Well, I'm not sure if it was bait and switch, but I thought it was timely. And I also thought it was timely when I originally wrote that in 2002. That was word for word what I wrote in 2002. And I don't have any doubt that the same situation, that's why I did that. And it may be a little bit, that's maybe not the right way to do things, but I figured, I mean, I wasn't being dishonest, I was being lazy. All right. So that's why in the last paragraph of this column I said, there will be free parking, no admission charge, and a minor revelation about what you've just read. So that's the minor revelation. But the point of this is the superficial discussion of the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend, I think, is a long-running problem in Alaska. And it is getting worse because now, for really the first time in the state's history, it's an essential part of keeping state government in operation. And we have to come to grips with that and recognize what that means for the future. The permanent fund income first surpassed oil income during the tech boom of the late 1990s, when a lot of great stocks you don't hear of anymore were doing really well, and oil was $9 a barrel. That we are again now in a position where the permanent fund earns a lot more than oil, and it really needs to be paid attention to. And generally, we're not paying any attention to it at all. There's no reporter covering the permanent fund in any manner in the state because it's financial stuff and it's boring. And anyway, that's a real threat. The only person who's ever covered it at all in its history in any detail is Fred Pratt, who had approached it with his own point of view and his own belief that the dividend was all important and that other things didn't matter so much. Anyway, let me just get into this. Now, I did begin working on this topic. This is something I wrote. Don't try to read it. It'll ruin your eyes. This was a series I wrote in 1977. The headline is what's important. Here's how to invest $1 billion. Now, as is often the case, the headline promised a bit more than the story delivered, because no one in their right mind would ask 24-year-old me how to invest $1 billion, or 65-year-old me for that matter, but at that time, this is in 1977, the pipeline began operations in June of that year, and oil was pretty cheap. And the state income had started to increase finally, and state finances were improving, but not by much. It really took a guy, well, Don Young once referred to him as the Ayatollah Khomeini, but I think the Ayatollah really helped us a great deal in 1979, 1980, when oil prices doubled because of his antics. And because of the Iranian Revolution, the finances for Alaska really dramatically changed. And this story about the 11th legislature, Cinderella, which is actually, I like this headline, is right. This was with the legislature, starting in 1979, things were grim. 1980, the sky's the limit, and there was no limit to what was available. And that year, the legislature in 1980 spent in the supplemental capital budget and the fiscal year 81 capital budget, in today's dollars, close to $4 billion in capital projects. It's an incredible period there. And there are still lots of things around the state that came about from that area. It came about from that era. Jay Hammond vetoed a few crumbs, but most everything went through, and because of that, that's what allowed the dividend to pass as well in 1980. The dividend was first came about, it was Hammond's idea, clearly, with Alaska Inc., a topic he spoke about every chance he could get for his entire career as governor and for decades to follow. Today the vision of him is largely from people who weren't here when he was governor or weren't here when he was alive. A lot of people weren't when he was alive, and who cite 4 or 5 different quotes from a book that was published posthumously. And Hammond said a lot of different things about the permanent fund and the dividend, which you could use to make lots of political cases. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. This boom in 80, we're spending money on capital projects at a great rate, going to repeal the income tax, and start sharing some of the money with people. So that was sort of the 1980 era, the 1980 philosophy, which was best epitomized in some ways by the tax rebate thing for campaign contributions, in which you could make money on campaign contributions. Now, most people have forgotten this little episode, but you could actually, you could apply for a tax credit, you could get money back. So if you gave a politician $100, you could get money back on that, which didn't last for long, but it did exist. And but the dividend did not meet with its overwhelming support that it has now, right? That's a different situation. The politics of this was a lot different than it is today. And this is the editorial in the Daily News Miner. This is actually after, well, I'm getting this a little mixed up as usual because I'm a disorganized person, but this is when Bill Sheffield, who was elected after Hammond, ran on the idea of getting rid of the dividend. And Tom Fink, the Republican nominee for governor in 1982, also ran on the idea of getting rid of the dividend. Dick Randolph did not. And in some ways, Dick Randolph is the reason we have the dividend today. This was the editorial of the News Miner. There were lots and lots of skeptical politicians who had actually been in office and had to make decisions and weren't quite sure that what was approved in 1980 would be sustainable for the future. Now, the original dividend program was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. But first, it was struck down by Judge Ralph Moody in Anchorage. And I like this idea. One of the arguments was, and many of you know this, people who had lived here since statehood deserve more money than the people who had just flown in on the Pipeline Express from Dallas. And the reason they deserve more money is because they had made contributions to Alaska over all these years. Now, what Ralph Moody determined was, quote, it was nothing more than a bonus or reward for having been a resident of Alaska longer than certain other people. It's not necessarily, being here did not equate to making a contribution. And Ralph Moody was a bit of a contrarian. He had also struck down the Byrne Homestead initiative, which, well, I take that back. He actually, I think, supported it. I'm getting in over my head on that one. I forget it. But this is my brother shouting at me. But anyway, but Ralph Moody's thing was, just because you've been here a long time didn't mean you had made a contribution. You had just been here a long time. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court didn't use that thinking, but it did strike down Hammond's dividend plan, which was, you think about it now, there's just no chance that was ever going to pass muster by rewarding people in any state based on a substantial amount of money based on duration of residency for 20, 30 years. So, although Hammond, Av Gross, who was the Attorney General, and all the experts thought they had this right, Ron and Penny Zobel, who challenged it in court and won, they were correct. So the dividend program we ended up with was passed as a backstop, what was called, and it was more or less what exists to this day. The dividend being about 50% of earnings of the past 5 years. There's no magic to this formula. It's just something that the legislature came up with trying to cut a deal. And again, they didn't really want to do it, but Hammond was sort of badgering them on this. And he allowed all this immense capital budget to go through if the legislature would support the dividend program, which is what happened. Now, a bit of a detour here. This was something I wrote in 1982, which I've never forgotten this little incident. And so I'll tell you what it is. It's about Velasco Ibarra, and it was a Harvard economist mentioned this guy at to the Permanent Fund, and he was talking about how his campaign speech he was giving in Dos Gatos, Ecuador. And he said, and finally, when I'm elected again, we will build the biggest bridge in Ecuador right here in Dos Gatos, he said. But then there was a voice from the back of the crowd, but Senor Presidente, there is no river in Dos Gatos. So he responded, then we will also build the biggest river in Ecuador right here in Dos Gatos. So, anyway, that was a warning about what maybe Alaska should not do with its oil wealth. And, you know, to some extent, we avoided building bridges over non-existent rivers. But, and to other extent, we did not. But anyway, the capital budget passed, an immense capital budget, which had consequences, far-reaching consequences, because it set up the idea that all this capital money was something that legislators could just do whatever they wanted to do with it. And we have that legacy. It's kind of gone now with the disappearance of the capital budget since 2014. But that was really an improper system, I think, guaranteed to create wasteful programs. And it has. It's also done there's a lot of great programs, but it's also created some problems. You'll also, among these half dozen quotes that are cited from the book published posthumously by J. Hammond, Diapering the Devil, which, you know, you could tell was self-published because I don't think any publisher would have gone for that title, which is a clear Hammond idea title. That's exactly what he would like. I remember he once saying that he wanted his first book to be everything you always want to know about the legislature, but you were afraid I would tell you. I mean, and you know, why use 10 words when 10,000 will work better? You know, I mean, whatever. Anyway, but the last day he was in office, he proposed, and again, you don't have to read this, but here's the proposal he made. Sheffield was going to become governor. Sheffield opposed the dividend. Fink had run for office opposing the dividend. The legislature was very bitterly divided on this by 1982 because oil prices had crashed. Not crashed. The oil prices had dipped. We were not as wealthy as we thought we were in 1980. And so he proposed that instead of the dividend being based on 50% of earnings, that it be based on 25% of earnings. Now, this just so happens this was the same proposal that Hammond made in 1979, which was before the dividend was enacted in 1980. So those who claim or say that there's something magical about the formula should look at the full record, and Hammond said lots of different things. And this is a memo he sent to Clem Tillion, who was president of the Senate, saying his bottom line is 50% of income returned to general fund, 50% of income for specific programs, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, 25% being returned to individuals. That's the key. So, again, when Sheffield comes into office, it's hard to see this. This is Tom Snap's headline in the Law School Weekly. Sheffield wants massive state austerity program. Wants dividends out, student loans cut, longevity pay phased out. Actually, he meant longevity bonus, but well, there was also longevity pay. So, so the legislature in 1983 was debating this a lot. I like this headline because there are probably 100,000 people in Alaska who think it's the Permanent Dividend Fund. And but I could see what the headline writer here was getting at. Sheffield kept at this, keeps continuously arguing that this is what, that state could not afford the dividend. Now, some of you may remember Michael Jehovah Beasley. And anyway, he actually got on the front page of the New York Times with this plan that he said, why give $1,000 per person? Let's give $10,000 per person. And of course, Michael J. Beasley didn't say where the $3 billion would come from. But anyway, there were conflicting polls about this. Now, I'm not sure I believe this poll that Joe Hayes released saying 65% of Alaska residents didn't want cash distributions. But the whole attitude about government and what government would do was different in 1983 than it is today. The dividend nearly was repealed by the State House in 1983. It survived by 3 votes. I think it's worth remembering that this period in state history, it's wrong to think that the dividend had this exalted position at all times in the state, because it just didn't. People thought, what are you doing, Jay Hammond? This is a crazy idea. And it was only because of the excesses of spending, I think, in 1980 and the repeal of the income tax that allowed this to take place. But things sort of began to change fairly quickly. By 1986, everyone running for governor could only take one position on the dividend, and that was the best thing that had ever happened, and it should continue. And I see my slides are out of order here, but I do have to tell you, this is my favorite political ad of all time. Now, what does it have to do with what I just said? Nothing. But politicians, I guess this is our other thing. We think of politicians telling people, well, wait, let's make it. I still have this question. Who the hell is Dux Thompson? And he's from Douglas. He was from Douglas. Anyway, you don't see an ad like that every day, and that's what I think is a good campaign ad. Well, there were conflicting polls, and within a few years, forget this is too foggy, blurry. So if you wanted a really good presenter here, you would have some. All right. All right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Along the lines of telling people what they want to hear when you're a politician. Now, I like to cite this example as that's not always the case, but it is often the case. So this is Al Rowe, Alphys Rowe. His real name is Alphys. I like this quote. You naive, gutless, so-called Alaskans make me sick with your gullibility and your admiration of liars and your lackadaisical indifference to what is happening in our beloved Alaska. And like this, and even Vogler, he was even too much for Joe Vogler. Okay, all right, back to what I was talking about. By 1986, and I'm glad Sam Bishop is here, one of the youngest people in the room, Sam Bishop, who used to work at the Daily News Monitor, and he wrote this story in 1986. And this lead is correct. Giving away money earned by oil companies and invested by the state was a controversial idea a few years ago, but to listen to gubernatorial candidates in 1986, there is not a better one today. So everybody was in favor of it in 1986, and I think it was because of the excesses of the 1980s, getting rid of the income tax, and more money than we knew what to do with and to handle properly. The Permanent Fund came into creation in 1976 by constitutional amendment, approved 2-to-1. the idea was you better save some money because if we don't, we're going to blow it. And that turned out to be a very wise decision. It was probably the best decision that has ever been made in the state since oil was discovered in the late 60s, because the money would have been gone by now. It would have been long gone. Anyway, okay, let me move on. So everybody's supporting the dividend, and it means you're going to attack all your opponents all the time about if you're soft on if you're soft on the dividend, you better be strong on the dividend or you're going to get attacked. And so I'm just going to show you a few ads here over the years on this. This was a Ernest Sturgielewski ad complaining about Mr. Cooper, questioning his commitment to the dividend and everything else. Dick Randolph, again, was strong in favor of the dividend. Dick's big thing was petition drives and initiatives. And I guess I look at this now and I think it's pretty easy to get people to sign something saying that they want more money. and that's what happened here. That's what happened with the income tax. That's why the income tax was repealed. The legislature repealed the income tax because it was going to be on the ballot and everybody knew it was going to pass. The repeal was going to pass. So, it's easy to get people to sign that, and it's easy to get people to sign something saying that they want the dividend. Now, this statement from '86 basically has been up until almost today has been the standard political posture in Alaska. I will not reimpose the tax or take away your dividend or do anything without a vote of the people, right? That became standard practice as of '86. Everybody was, spouting that idea. Robin Taylor, he made great use of his dividend ads throughout the years. Vote to protect your dividend. This, I think, is some of you may remember this. And this was the, I thought this one was pretty low. But this one was pretty low too. And this was actually not sponsored by Ralph Seekins in his campaign against Mr. Davies. This is the Republican Party that took out these ads in 2002. And Mr. Davies had taken a position with a bipartisan group of legislators in 2002 to try and solve what was an immediate financial problem that included a bunch of Republicans were involved in it as well. So I always go back and think of these particular ads as sort of the worst examples of this, extremely a cheap shot about this. But, to be fair, the Davies campaign responded with this, and I'm not sure if the big con relates to a personal attack or just the con job as the campaign, but anyway. Both parties have been involved in this. What's the real threat to your PFD? The Republican do-nothing budget plan. Well, makes good ammunition. Today, one of the things I do right now, I write a column for the Arctic Today website. So I write a weekly column for that. And actually today, the GAO released a pretty good report on the Coast Guard acquisition process. And the House is expected to vote tomorrow on the Homeland Security bill, which includes $5 billion for the big, beautiful wall, and strips $750 million, which was for the big, beautiful, heavy icebreaker. Now, one of the things, and what struck me today, I was thinking about this, is this GAO report makes extensive use of the point of view that what is lacking in the Coast Guard process for acquiring all the ships it needs in the future is a failure to discuss trade-offs and priorities. And that is sort of what we have with state revenue and the permanent fund and the dividend. So the trade-offs and priorities don't come into the discussion at all. A few more. This is Jim Campbell going after, actually this is against Knowles. Wally Hickel said lots of things about the dividend as well. He did say it's a mistake. And so the Sturgill-Lewski, and Arlo Sturgill-Lewski had good reason to be angry at Jack Cogga and Wally Hickel. So, but their best ad was this one. Well, which is, you can't see it, but anyway, it's Which Way, Wally? Yeah. Wally says today the truth, Wally, which way, Wally? Anyway, you can't get the full gist of that because I cropped it poorly. But, Tony Knowles responded with this, Alaska needs a leader, not a formula. Once the permanent fund is transformed from a savings account to a spending account, you can kiss it goodbye. Tony Knowles. So, yeah, well, that's a legitimate argument. And one of the things that became a problem for Tony Knowles is that in 1982, again, when Sheffield was trying to get rid of the dividend, Tony was a municipal official, and he was quoted in a story saying that Bill Sheffield is the man with a plan, and he liked the idea of getting rid of the dividend in 82. I don't think Frank Murkowski was talking about that when he had his plan. But his plan, as you'll notice, is not going to touch the dividend or an income tax. So anyway, a little bit before, and of course, the big part of the plan that you didn't know about until later on was the longevity bonus that had to be done away with, and the tire tax. Now, you all remember the tire tax? Anyway, so he was criticized pretty heavily for the tire tax and for the longevity bonus.
Explain what the tire tax was.
It was a tax on tires. I don't remember how much it was, but it was a tax on tires. But anyway, I just thought it was funny because it's a minuscule tax, and one of the big campaigns between the time it was enacted and now, I think Sean Parnell was helping to get rid of that tire tax. We need to get rid of the tire tax. That was also about the time when Governor Parnell was trying to get rid of that 8-cent per gallon state gasoline tax, which was set in 1962. So anyway, let me, again, this was a fairly younger person. You can't really see me up there, but this was about the 1999 vote, and I still believe that this was correct, that vote, although it was overwhelmingly negative, it was an advisory vote, which is always a bad idea. Secondly, it was a 28-word question about, do you want to do this or that and the other thing, and maybe we could fix the problem this way. Yes or no? We remain in that problem now. We remain in that situation now because Mike Dunleavy, Meade Treadwell, and Mark Begich are all in favor of, well, not Treadwell, but Begich and Dunleavy are in favor of putting the dividend in the Constitution. And I guess my question would be, well, why would that be in the Constitution instead of, what about schools? Do you think schools should be in the Constitution? Or?
They are.
Well, do you think paying for schools should be in the Constitution? And actually, that is in the Constitution. It says the state will provide schools, but that doesn't mean you have to pay for it, right? So, anyway, that's part of the problem with the constitutional argument. One, it's going to be very difficult to get the supermajority in the legislature to put it on the ballot, and it's also a bad idea because, again, it neglects trade-offs and priorities. So if we've allowed politicians largely to run on this very, very snapshot idea that protecting the dividend is all important, nothing else is. And that's probably been that's led to the situation where we are today. The action taken by the legislature this year was a dramatic turn in allowing, well, say this differently. When oil prices collapsed starting in 2014, since we have an alleged net profits tax, they went almost to zero. In fact, they did go below the tax went below zero because we don't have a gross tax, we have a net tax, the only one in the United States. And the sky was falling. So we've spent $14 billion of earnings, of reserves piled up under the ACES tax regime. And we've now kind of spent that. And I think the legislature approved that bill this year, which spends some of the earnings of the permanent fund for state government. I think that came about largely because of this politics created by Walker vetoing half of the dividend. That changed the discussion. And because no one who ran for office in 2014 was envisioning anything like that. And so the discussion changed. I am not sure how the dividend should be handled in the future. I just know that it can't be handled in isolation. And allowing politicians to talk about it in isolation is what's the problem, because there are trade-offs to be made. If you want to preserve the dividend, how are you going to do it? Anyway, that information is really lacking from many political candidates, Republicans and Democrats. And yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'll just go back to this thing I wrote 16 years ago. And I do believe it's still correct that someday we may have a campaign season in which there will be an informed discussion about the potential Alaska Permanent Fund. It hasn't happened yet. So I would like to have a few discussion here if you'd like, because I'm sure all of you may may disagree with me on certain things. So, but I should ask Sam, since he wrote that great story 30 years ago. Sam, do you remember the politics of this? Why did things change in 1986 with the gubernatorial candidates?
Yeah. I'm sure I'm glad to hear you acknowledge my lead was correct.
All right. The rest of it was okay, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Without covering it, I don't remember the details, but it was clear that it was not even touched by them. And Joe Vogler and Von Wright were sort of the candidates who were out on the fringe opposing it. And I think it was untouchable in part, as you said, because of the huge capital budgets that had been passed, and it sort of had diffused the desire to turn the fund into a funding mechanism to boost the state economy. But then, so that interested people, and then people had already gotten used to it.
Right. And I think it has had great economic benefits in some ways. I mean, our kids went to college largely because of the money from the Permanent Fund Dividend. I do think it prevented the Permanent Fund from becoming a development bank, which would have been a disaster, because all the money would have been loaned out to questionable, they wouldn't all be questionable projects, but would have been loaned out to lots of questionable projects, and would have disappeared. The decision to invest largely outside of Alaska was a very controversial one, and Tom Fink, was among those Anchorage businessmen who opposed it. They wanted cheap loans, and they wanted mortgages subsidized, and they wanted, that kind of development that goes to people with a head for business generally, or head for getting cheap loans. It would have vanished pretty quickly. That's kind of what happened in Alberta, which has a much smaller sovereign wealth fund, and that was started about the same time. So it's had great benefits there, but I think the one clear difference you see is between what way candidates behave and the way elected officials behave. Once people are elected, most of them, if they have any smarts, and most of them do, they realize that things are, everything they said in the campaign was questionable or a lie. No, it wasn't a lie. That's not fair. That's not fair. But they realize that they say things in campaigns just to get elected. And people want to hear that you'll protect the dividend. But so I think if you're candidate X, you say that, I say, okay, how do you tend to cut spending? And don't tell me it's waste, fraud, and abuse, or you're going to make it government more efficient. How many schools do you want to close? Now, that is noticeable. Or what kind of taxes do you want? Get that into discussion. Then you can have a really informed discussion about the dividend. It would be easy to do, but no one running for office wants to have it that way. And the state of journalism is today that nobody's really demanding or pushing. The news organizations don't have the influence or reach that they once had, and they're not making that case. I'm not sure if they ever really did have that power to do that, but they just sort of go along with this idea that I don't know how many thousands of times I've heard, the third rail of Alaska politics. Well, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, really? Well, but I guess there's one other thought I have on that, is that Alaska was lucky in the sense that we could ignore the permanent fund for all these decades, and we did, because oil revenue was high enough to allow it to be off to the side, and nobody was really paying attention. And I'm not kidding about that. People were really not paying attention to it. I don't know anything that's improper. I'm not suggesting anything is wrong at all, but it's just done without much legislative oversight. Most of the legislators they're not really clued into this. It's pretty high-level stuff, and no one's really paying that much attention, as long as the money keeps rolling in. But we've had the luck to be one of the you can exclude 2009, that little thing that happened then. But since the early 80s, it's been the greatest, stock market increases in history. And the expansion of the permanent fund into stock investments in the 80s was a big thing. It was a big, benefit. To begin with, the permanent fund was only going to be invested in bonds, and that's what it was invested in early on. And in fact, there was a Republican move in 1976 to ban stock market investments in the constitutional amendment. And it's pretty lucky that amendment didn't pass. That would have been that would have created real problems for us overall. Anyway, I know I'm talking too long. You must have some other questions, or any questions.
Inflation proofing was positive. Inflation proofing.
Oh yeah,
Thank goodness.
Yeah, and that is something that wouldn't have come about again without sort of external pressure. And Elmer Rasmussen early on helped set up the guidelines of this in ways that let's see. Now, Elmer Rasmussen ran for office and lost, but he wasn't running for office at that time. So a politician running for office wouldn't have cared so much about that. But that did become a big thing. It's a little bit different when you're talking about inflation proofing and you get away from bonds, because to some extent, inflation-proof gains, capital gains, are one way you combat inflation. So it's a little bit dicey there, but that's helped increase the size of the fund, along with the large and additional investments made in the fund by the legislature in the 80s. And again, we had more money than could be rationally spent, and those extra billions really have paid off. Today, and for many years now, the major returns we're getting are not from oil investments. They're from investments that were originated with oil investments, but that's now in shopping malls, and the permanent fund has a very diversified, expansive portfolio, and it's worth $65 billion right now, and about $40 billion of that is in the principal. So it's around $25 billion that is up for grabs. I have a fear that I think is what's going to happen. I don't think anyone is going to cut the budget by $1 billion. That was the Mike Dunleavy plan a year and a half ago. Don't think it's going to be cut by, I mean recurring. The operating budget is not going to be cut by $1 billion, but it's not going to be cut by 500 million. Might be cut somewhat. You know, tens of millions would be, could be cut, right? Hundreds of millions, you're going to have a political backlash, and so that's why people don't want to say how they want to cut the $1 billion, because they don't. First of all, they don't have any idea how to do it. Secondly, they know you're not going to get elected to anything if you say that, or you know, if you advocate that. So there's no plan to cut hundreds of millions of dollars. There's just none. Now, but what I fear is going to happen is that the bill, a law approved this year, in which some permanent fund earnings are helping pay for the cost of government, includes a promise that the percentage will be cut back a little bit in a few years. And I think the most likely legislative solution is going to be to monkey with that percentage, because it wouldn't be hard to say to the constituents, look, we don't want to close that school, let's just increase this by 0.5%. That's not much. And I think that's the really long-term, that's really the long-term issue here when you continue to operate without any taxes. And we'll go back to Hammond and close with this.
I thought you already closed.
Yeah, well. Wait, okay, after I'm done, just wait. Hammond, anyone who purports to know the Hammond theory about this stuff should also know that half of the Hammond theory was you better have taxes. And that's one reason why we're in this current pickle, is because since there are no taxes, you can't really go to the, that's one check on the size of government. And, but that's, so anyway, sir?
I agree with you. I mean, that's the thing I wanted to make, that the tax problem was the lack of context, and that is the great disservice. And I don't know if Dick Randolph is here, but with that, I don't think he is. I don't think he would come here to you.
No, I've had many conversations with him over the years. There's something I like him.
I didn't say I disliked him. I'm just saying it was a terrible thing to do, to abolish the state income tax, and not to tie the dividend should have been tied to the income tax, because every single person in Alaska has received a double dividend ever since then. They have been essentially no income tax. That should have been kept on the books, because people got, the reason why Sam's article, they got used to the payment. By '86, that was the 4th year. And remember, the first payment was $1,000. But Hammond's original plan was only $50 a year, capped at 20 years, I believe. So the original PFD, you would have got $50 a year, and it was capped, I think, at 1,000. But the problem is, no Alaskan would have voted to give $1,000 to somebody who came off the Pipeline Express and had been here for 6 months. If that had started as the original proposal, it would have never been approved.
Right, but the backstop plan did give a dividend to anybody who was here for 6 months.
No, I mean, no, that's the backstop plan. It was a stupid plan, yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's why it was almost repealed, because...
Right, exactly. Because people were opposed to that. But remember, the income tax was abolished by the legislature by a vote of 58-1. Somebody was missing, I don't know who that was, and Tillian wasn't running for re-election, so he voted against it. But even a former chancellor of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, forget his name, Brian Rogers.
Okay, all right, no, okay, but Terrence, okay, look, I've had this argument with him before, but here's part of the issue. And again, Jay Hammond could have vetoed that, right? But 58-1, it would have been overridden. So, Hammond said later how much he regretted not vetoing it. Well, yeah, he could have vetoed it, but it would have been overridden. It would have been on the ballot. And that would have, people running for office don't like to see things like that on the ballot, because it might bring out voters who don't like you. That's sort of the reason you don't like those on the ballot.
So before Hammond died...
Oh, good, they cut the microphone off, that's good.
Before Hammond died, I interviewed him for about 6 or 8 hours. and you can find it, it's up on the
Yeah.
YouTube. Anyway, so I asked him about this, and I always told him that was the worst, most cowardly thing he ever did was not to veto that.
Right.
And he offered this lame excuse, well, I wouldn't have been reelected. He forgot to mention, he forgot he was in his second term already.
And he wasn't
out.
Yeah.
And so that was his big excuse.
Okay, all right, well,
But he should have vetoed it.
okay, but it still wouldn't have been overridden, so it's, you know.
Well, no, but that's just still, as a matter of principle.
All right,
for a
and
guy who always, Mr. Diaper in the devil.
okay,
Right, I'll shut up. All right.
but he said for many years that this was his biggest regret, that he didn't veto it. Now, of course, also in that interview, which is actually, I'm glad that you did that because it, you know, there's this much, in that interview, I think he goes on to complain about people calling this a rainy day fund. And he says, one of his favorite words, bull feathers. That's how he said it. Well, it wasn't, he often said it was a rainy, he did say it was a rainy day fund. So he kind of argued against himself there. Yeah, Sue.
Well, if you could use your 65-year-old crystal ball and maybe tell us what conditions you think would have to be met to have this discussion, this broad-based discussion that isn't fixated on the dividend, that would actually look at the mix of taxes, dividend, expenditures. It seems like in 2014 we had the perfect occasion for that, and it didn't happen. So what do you think it would take to actually make this discussion?
Right, I'll repeat the question. It was about what kind of circumstances would we need to have an informed discussion about the permanent fund and the dividend now? Well, I think, I disagree with you to a little bit. I think much of that did take place in the legislature. Now, unfortunately, it was stymied in the Senate by the simple claim that, well, we don't need no stinking taxes. That leaves us in the same situation where we are mightily dependent on oil prices and now on the earnings of the permanent fund, which are going to be cyclical. I mean, it's not, we've had many good years now since 2009, but 2008 was a pretty bad year. And so now we're shifting into this era of dependency. I'm not sure how we get this full discussion going, but I do think it, you know, for anybody, again, it's the difference between the actual business of making laws and setting policy and campaigning. Campaigning has almost nothing to do with the job. But I guess the job is to get elected. So the politician will say, the job is to get elected, and then you make the hard decisions. When Frank Murkowski ran in 2002, you know, he wasn't going to raise taxes and he wasn't going to touch the dividend. And Fran Ulmer wasn't going to touch the permanent fund without a vote of the people. Again, repeating that, what become a big mantra since '86 by almost every politician. But she did have a parachute plan, which I can't explain. It was some Hammond weird, he always was an expert at the Rube Goldberg schemes. He really was. But she said that the parachute plan, the one thing that might avoid the need for the parachute plan would be a rapid increase in oil prices. And that's what we had. You know, a couple things happened here. Frank Murkowski raised oil taxes, changed ELF a little bit, and then in one of the many failed gas line efforts, the PPT tax was approved. However, thanks to the FBI, the PPT tax was overturned, really. I mean, that's the way you want to look at it. Because of the FBI, ACEs passed. It happened at almost exactly the right time in history because then oil went to $140. And, you know, this state reserves took this increase that they're not going to see again, I think. Gosh, that's not a very good answer to your question. But I'm not sure how to get a better discussion other than people telling politicians, look, that's not enough. I just don't want to hear you saying you're going to protect the PFD. I mean,
that's what most people want to hear. Like, that's the
I think you're right. That's what they want to hear. Yeah.
I'm just telling people that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to. Yes. Yeah.
campaign, no taxes, let's not have any new taxes, is driven by the oil companies, and they're not wanting to change the tax structure so that they're actually paying taxes on most of their new oil fields?
Well, okay, the question is how much of this maybe no tax campaign is linked to oil company opposition to increased taxes. Well, the oil companies have been really making the same argument since the 70s, which is you've changed oil taxes X number of times in the last number of years, right? The first made that argument in 77, 78. And indeed, the oil taxes changed quite a bit. That's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Because let's say the tax went down every year. They wouldn't mind that change every year. So it's not just the number of changes that's involved here. I think that smart oil company officials would like the idea of an income tax or state sales tax because they would realize that that may help them avoid something in the future, you know. The SB 21 ACES thing is very complicated. It's not that. That's not why we have the problem we have today. It's not because of that change. It's a contributing factor to our future dilemma, but it's not. That's not why we have the problem we do. I don't think that's the reason. I think it's this being used to it. This is the land of no taxes. I think that's it. Yeah, Don?
You know, one of the best things is you, as the press, in your blog, to keep reminding us. You know, it's the old Pogo speech of, well, we've met the enemy and he is us. But beyond that, there are some things like reminding people about how an income tax worked in Alaska before 1980. You know, that it was, that particular version might not work today, but it was easy to calculate.
Yeah.
It was progressive rather than regressive, and it was used in conjunction also as ways to finance things. We also used to have bond issues and would pay things. People got used to the idea that, gee, I don't really want to do this, but somebody's got to pay for it, and I guess it's us. And we don't have that.
That's not really not the dominant political discussion. I think, I'm not really sure how to go about improving the situation. I agree with you. I mean, I guess one point that's underplayed is how much of the permanent fund dividends over the years have gone to the federal government. It's probably, it must be 15% at least, I would guess, if you add it up. Yes?
We had the same problem in 1986 and then again in 1998 when oil tanked. Okay?
Yeah.
I was living in Anchorage at the time. There were three things you couldn't get rid of in Anchorage: herpes, AIDS, and condo and lagoon.
Or a mobile home.
Or mobile home. But all that stuff, I mean, we seem to get through it. People left in droves, especially in '86.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just leaving and leaving and leaving. And as the state has expanded since then, we've cut the budget $4 billion since its max in 2014. Something like that, 3.7 billion.
Yeah, the capital budget virtually disappeared. Yeah.
Well, but the operating budget has gone down.
Somewhat, but the operating budget is a difficult thing to cut because inflation and cost increases every year are continual, and there are lots of things you can't cut. Now, I read there was a certain candidate the other day said he'll cut anything except the Department of Natural Resources. Well, okay, great. You want to cut, you got to cut the schools. Yeah, well, we spend over $1 billion on schools. You could save 500 million by closing half the schools or more. I mean, anyway, but that's a trade-off. So do you want a dividend or this or anyway, I guess I don't have an answer to that, but I agree with you. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
So you talked a little bit about logic, right? The reasoning with people, but it seems like appeals to emotion are what really work right now. So is there some sort of appeal to emotion for the argument of taxes. You mentioned education a couple of different times, and to me, you know, the closing of these schools, I mean, there has to be some part of that people struggle to deal with. And is there some way to use that field of emotion and education to benefit this argument?
Well, okay, the questions deal with education and creating an emotional argument. Well, one of the early plans to use permanent fund earnings was Steve Cooper's plan for an education endowment, which was in '89, I think, or 80, and it failed by 1 vote in the Senate, if I remember right. And and actually Mark Begich just talked about something like that, and it's an emotional argument. I'm not sure if it works. I mean, the counter to that is the argument, well, the schools aren't any good anyway, and people are doing poorly. Well, I guess the theory is that you're going to get a lot better schools if you spend a lot less money on them. And so if you pay teachers a lot less, you'll get a lot better teachers. Now, and you know, that I don't think it's true. I mean, so I don't think you're going to get better people into teaching if you pay them a lot less money. You might have an increase in, you know, I don't know what. Anyway, I don't have an answer. Sorry. Oh, Joe. Yeah.
You're a real economist.
All right.
Hi, I'm Joe Scott. We left Alaska not because we didn't like the winters or not that we didn't like our permanent fund. We were getting older. Okay. I follow this quite closely. Thank goodness you're online with the news runner. But I don't pretend to know all the answers, but I have a lot of questions. I'm very concerned about the university. And I understand there's about $65 billion now in the permanent fund, is that right?
Yeah.
And I understood that a year ago or so, Mr. Rasmussen, and was it Mr. Goldsmith too, had written ideas about how to save your permanent fund and still be able to use some of the...
Yeah, Joe, there's lots of ways you could do that. Yeah.
But how come, what's the deal?
Well, because we have people in the Senate who are ideologically opposed to any tax. And, well, because there are, in the Senate, I mean, we would have had some taxes approved, but the ideological opposition in the Senate to any tax increase. That's why there were no tax increases. And I believe, actually, I think the path Walker chose is sensible. You're going to nick a bunch of people, you take a little bit here and there, and that's a sensible way of doing it, I think. But this outright opposition to any taxes is going to create a bigger problem. And I think just a drain on the, that is a real future dividend threat, or it's also a threat to the stability of the state. But I mean, it's, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it. Yes?
In the early days of the permanent fund, I did something that I expect a lot of people in this. I did something early on in the permanent fund in the dividend days that I expect a lot of people in this audience did, and that was just give the money away. So that a lot of community organizations, and churches, and charities, and the arts benefited from that. And now we have pick, click, and give. And maybe we should just require that all the money in the permanent fund dividend be given away.
Well, Don, I could see your campaign for office has already started there. I just think I mean, I like the idea. It has benefited many nonprofit groups in Alaska that have, and it also helped a lot of people get a bit out of poverty and send lots of kids to school. So it's had a lot of benefits. I just don't hold it as I just don't believe it's the supreme function of state government. So, I mean, if you really want people, this is where Hammond was wrong. I think he always claimed endlessly this would create a constituency to protect the permanent fund. Well, it created a constituency to protect the dividend, which is different than the permanent fund. If you really want a constituency to protect, or if you want an informed constituency, have a tax. Now, you know, I don't agree with the law just passed that is going to penalize legislators if they don't pass a budget by a certain day. I don't think that's a good idea. I do think more informed approach by them, being honest about our finances would help, you know. And unfortunately, a lot of candidates are not being that. I mean, that's, you know, and I don't think it's going to change this year. So, based on the ads I've seen so far. So, yeah.
I think most politicians, fear.
Yeah.
I think most politicians fear the person that can do some analytical thinking. Where do you learn analytical thinking? You learn it in school. And that's why I believe there is a disinterest in, and really an animosity toward education in this state and this nation. Nobody in elected office wants a thinking, competent electorate. And so the easiest way to ensure that you don't have is to cut education.
That seems logical to me. That's what's going on. And this is one time where I think the state should be spending a lot more on the university, frankly, and not because, you know, not just to spend more money, but to improve its operations, because our young people are at real risk of having them being you know, automated out of a job or being outsourced. You know, I mean, we really have a problem here. This focus on, we're not doing very well on standardized tests, neglects the key reasons for that the economic and social situation, particularly in minority families, where it's, you know, you're asking a lot of teachers, right, to overcome a lot of hardships. You're putting too much on them, I think. But anyway, it's at 8 o'clock or 8:05, so. Sorry. Oh, okay, sure. So, Carl, did you have a question? No? All right, yes.
Hi, Byrne.
Yeah.
I'll make a comment. I stand, but my wheelchair doesn't go up in the air too easily. Make a comment. I'm happy to pay a dividend as long as it's simple, like a 5% of the federal. But I'm not happy to pay a dividend, I'm sorry, an income tax.
Yes.
I'm not happy to pay an income tax, which would might raise $700 million, when proposed by the House majority, if the net effect would be to pay for 30% of a $2,700 dividend, which would cost $1.9 billion. So I see a disconnect between paying out $1.9 billion in dividends and only collecting $700 million in income tax.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that has to be worked out in a legislative process that's functional, you know. I mean, where you have those arguments to be made, not just, well, we don't want any taxes. Anyway, so thank you for coming.
For our